Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Could find a seat. We're gonna attempt to do something different today. At some point, I want you to be able to converse with somebody else. That doesn't mean you got to be right on top of somebody else. You're with family. Thank you. Then you're naturally set up to discuss with someone next to you. But, if you want to try to work to be within shouting distance of somebody else, to have someone to converse with, we're going to do that today for a few minutes later on in class. Okay, in terms of material, we're basically out. I think Justin took the last one today, the last booklet that's been made. Remember, the material is online, so if you're sitting here in the auditorium and you don't have your booklet for one reason or another, you can, on a device, look up the material on our website, Media Bible Class Material, 1 Corinthians. Obviously, if you're live streaming this right now or later on and are at home, then you can find that material as well and keep up that way. I'll just say one more word about material, which is that if you have a booklet or are looking at it, you'll notice that there's not much left in the material. That there's one more class of a cross-section number 6, that we'll be doing for Wednesday, and that's the end. That's it. Starting next Sunday, the plan is to jump into our actual study of 1 Corinthians chapter by chapter or so. And I will have more material to give to you to be a guide, a study guide for those lessons, which will be, the most of the rest of our quarter together. So those will be posted at some point, and then I'll come in with copies, hole-punched copies on Sunday or Wednesday probably, to hand out, and you can stuff your folder yourself with the next set of handouts. So be looking for that. Again, either online or here in class. Okay, let's jump in with a little bit of a review. This is the same review from Wednesday. I'm just not making you fill it out on your own, but I maybe shout out an answer and then let others shout out, so one answer apiece. Our volcano chart here, illustrating what's going on in Corinth like a volcano. By the way, I got on YouTube last night to create the stream, and they had a live feed of a volcano in Iceland. It had been going for 15 hours. There's some camera in Iceland, you could watch this volcano. It was really cool. I mean, it wasn't much happening other than just, lava flowing and spewing every once in a while. But I thought, well, that's interesting. But if the volcano is the situation in Corinth, what kind of things go on top? What is the lava, the spewing, the smoke? What goes up there? Behavior, what else would we say? Actions, okay? So the things that you see, the visible things, are the destructive things in the case of Corinth. That's on top. What's below the surface? Attitudes, beliefs, okay? The things going on in our heart. Michael made reference to this effectively around the Lord's table this morning. And so it's from those things, you could think of a million Bible verses that say this, right? From the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks, or, whatever's on the inside is going to come out, a good tree bears good fruit, all that kind of stuff. It is the beliefs, the attitudes, what's in the heart that then pours forth the outward things, okay? So if you were going to address the top, if you only wanted to address the top, what is the solution for the above the line issues? Rules, okay? And what addresses the below the line issues? Principles, okay? And again, I said this on Wednesday, I'm not anti-rules in this class, and I don't think I don't think God is anti-rules. But again, to refer to what Michael said, there does need to be a connection between the rules and the principles. Rules by themselves may start to get us into more trouble if they're not based on anything or they're based on the wrong thing, okay? But with the proper principles in place, then we can fully understand and most effectively carry out the rules, if that makes sense, okay? Okay, In the book of 1 Corinthians, how does Paul want the Christians to address their problems? This is one word. It comes from one of the first cross sections we did, I think number 1. One word for how Paul wants the Christians to address their problems. Judgment. He wants them to use good, spiritual, mature judgment to address their problems. What is the main behavior problem in Corinth? Divisions. What is the main attitude problem in Corinth? Arrogance. What are the 3 sources of pride? From 1 Corinthians 1, also from Jeremiah 9. Wisdom is the first one. Might is the second one, and wealth is the third one. And then what event, going back all the way to our introductory first class, what event does Paul refer to throughout the book of 1 Corinthians? Maybe even once in every chapter, at least. Yeah, the end of the age. Okay? So that's our review. I will show you again Jeremiah 9, 23 and 24. I would love for this to be, or maybe it will be at some point, a memory assignment, which it has enough of a cadence, a rhythm to it, a pattern to it, I think is the word I'm looking for, that maybe it would be easier to memorize. Thus says the Lord, let not a wise man boast of his wisdom. Let not the mighty man boast of his might. Let not a rich man boast of his riches. But let him who boasts boast of this, that he understands and knows me, that I am Jehovah, who exercises loving kindness, justice, and righteousness on earth. For I delight in these things, says Jehovah. Remember, what's interesting is that the part that Paul actually quotes verbatim in 1 Corinthians 1 is the boasting in the Lord part. Let him who boasts boast in the Lord. But he has already made reference in 1 Corinthians 1 to the wise, the mighty, and the rich. And so he's clearly kind of analyzing this passage for us. And I think Jeremiah 9 is a key verse for 1 Corinthians because it tells us the problem as well as the solution. Because throughout the book, not only is Paul reprimanding them for boasting in their wisdom, their might. Remember, by might we mean power, influence, control, status in the church, all that, and their wealth. But he's also challenging them, pushing them, encouraging them, pleading with them to put their boast in God and the character of God by emulating that and focusing on it and having true knowledge of him. Okay. And then the last thing I was going to kind of draw out from Wednesday's class was if you plug in our problems, both attitude and behavior problems from Corinth, they are arrogant. There is an attitude problem, a heart problem. There is an attraction to worldly wisdom that is puffing them up, and that is leading to divisions of various kinds. The 2 clearest examples of this in the book are in chapters 1 to 4, where they will be exalting human teachers. Why? Well, because they're hung up on the way the world thinks. They're hung up on valuing, this guy's got a degree. Oh, this guy just speaks really well. He's moving in his rhetoric, And so this false understanding of what true wisdom is attracts them to the things of the world. It exalts human teachers, and then once you start saying, "Oh, well, I like this preacher," or I with this teacher, I follow his philosophy, well, then the fissures in the church begin to run deeper and deeper. Okay, and then in chapters 8 to 10, there's also going to be a clear example of this. This is the beginning of the section where Paul says, "Knowledge makes arrogant. Knowledge puffs up." So the problem, in large part, is that in gaining knowledge about idols being nothing, then Christians are just saying, "Oh, well, we know. We're so smart, we figured out that idols are nothing. There's only one God, so it doesn't matter if I eat meat that's been sacrificed to idols." And so they indulge freely in that, even though it is offensive to weaker brethren, so to speak, brothers that don't have that same understanding of it. And so there are those kinds of divisions in the church, all tracing back to an arrogance of knowledge. All right, let's jump in. Cross-section number 5, hopefully you're looking at. What we'll do is we're going to add an extra stage in this exercise. So we're going to spend a few minutes looking at it ourselves, so silent work time, looking at cross-section 5, the verses in your booklet, and thinking through what is the common element, what is tying all these verses together, and why is that significant. Then in a few minutes, I'll ask you to talk about that with someone near you, and have those discussions amongst yourselves. And then I'll take a few responses to see if you can share what you talked about to the whole class in just a minute. So let's start by just looking at cross-section number 5 on our own and looking for the themes and the threads.
Well, I'm going to combine a couple things. Again, at the heart of all things, we have, the love, that kind of drives everything. But something that Terry had mentioned was, we still have themes of being unified. And I think it's that love that unites us, among other things that were said, that is.
To build on that, one of the things that Christy and I were discussing is that you see the reproof in Paul's writing, that he's admonishing the Corinthians. And one of the things that Christy pointed out is, can you imagine being in that position to where you were the one having to write this letter to these people, and the difficulty that you would have in regulating your tone and the words that you're using to get across the love that you have for them, but also still making sure that they see the importance and the seriousness of the themes that he's trying to exhibit to them.
So other than the scum word that came up repeatedly over here, the idea of being lowly before both your fellow man and before God, very closely aligned with humility.
Okay. Being lowly. Other thoughts? Albert?
Again, I think the challenge for these folks who had come from the Jewish faith and were now Christians, hierarchy was so important in their success of being seen as a successful Jew would be knowledge and being able to debate and argue those things. And here Paul is like, it's when we in our personal lives use the example of, if I was jealous, why would I then belittle myself? Or you're talking to somebody, or like, if I'm accused of being something, then why would I be trying to deprive myself in the scenario? And so when Paul has this, where he's talking about the scum and those words there, you are making success on being or defining success as being prominent and wisdom and wise, but yet we're here fighting the fight, and we're seen as lowly and humble, and it's a contrast. And it's just Paul going, don't you see, this is the path, and this is the path that we learn from Christ, to, those who humble themselves will be the greatest. So.
Thank you, Albert. Was this a harder one for you guys? Well, you had to practice on the easy ones to then work your way up to the double black diamond, whatever. No, part of what's difficult about this one compared to the other ones, I remember in the first, I'm on now, that's for sure. But in the first couple, it was like literally the same word was like showing up in each verse. That was especially true with like divisions, and that's true with arrogance, and judging. There's like every passage uses that word. But not the case in these verses, although as usual and as I expected, the things that you guys have said and shared about this are really, I think, what I wanted to highlight. And so let's do that with the rest of the time that we have. Real quickly, Dan, what time did you ring the first bell? 35? Oh, that's going to be the. Yeah. So 11:35 is when we're going to end, or when the first bell is going to ring. Okay, cool. All right, good. We got time, and so feel free to jump in with any contributions or questions as as we go through some of this. Humility, that's what I had. And if you wanted to write the one word on the line below cross-section number 5, that's the word that I have written. but you don't have to write the word that I have. But there are some interesting phrases. Scum's not on here, but it does relate. Maybe that's the most interesting phrase. But there are some interesting phrases in these verses that we've looked at. The first one is, and they're all loose. They're not all the exact same, or it would have been easier to identify perhaps. But this idea of being nothing or not anything, or just see what I mean with this. Chapter 2, verse 2, the first one. How Paul says, I determined, so read the whole thing. I did not come with superiority of speech or of wisdom, proclaiming to you the testimony of God. We've talked about that. That was the last class or the last couple classes, right? He said, I haven't bought into the false version of wisdom, which is like you can talk good and you seem to know a lot. He said, no, that wasn't me. Instead, verse 2, I determined to know nothing. Oh, the body pack's dead. Cool. Well, good. I can take that up here. I'll stay put. Try at least. I determined to know nothing, Paul says, among you, except Jesus Christ and him crucified. So that word nothing, I mean, that's a strong word. Okay, Paul says nothing. I wanted to be, I wanted to know nothing. What is there more than nothing? And of course, he adds on to that, nothing except Jesus Christ. But for his own personal standpoint, it's nothing. Next one, chapter 3, verse 7. So the next paragraph there. Notice a similar type of language here. What then, chapter 3, verse 5, is Apollos, and what is Paul? Servants through whom you believed, even as the Lord gave opportunity to each one. I planted, Apollos watered, but God was causing the growth. So then, verse 7, neither the one who plants nor the one who waters is anything. That's just another way of saying what he just said. Okay, not anything is nothing. Okay, so he says, myself and Apollos, we're nothing, but it's God who causes the growth. Okay, and then 11:11. I think this is why it gets in here, although it's maybe one of the more confusing ones. But in chapter 11, the beginning, whatever's going on, there is some confusion or conflict of the role of men and women in the church, in the assembly maybe particularly. And so Paul is addressing that. And notice one of the principles that he puts forth in chapter 11 is this. However, in the Lord, neither is woman independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as the woman originates from the man, so also the man has his birth through the woman, and all things originate from God. You see the point there? Okay? Men and women depend on each other. That's how we've been created, is that, you can't have one without the other, either way. Okay? They had to have Adam first, and then Eve came from Adam. And then from that point on, all the Adams came from Eve, So there is a mutual dependency, okay, between the men and the women. And I kind of see it the same way. I decided how philosophical to be here. It's like something that is something is only something if it can be something independently from everything else. And Patty's like, what are you saying? Okay. And so, maybe that's too confusing. But if man or woman can't be independent of the other, then that's maybe a around the bend way of saying they're nothing on their own because they are dependent on the other. And so 3 times here, perhaps, we have this idea, this phrasing, where Paul says, I'm nothing, you're not anything. That's a hard pill to swallow, perhaps, to empty oneself so much to say that, no, I'm just like a little bit. No, I'm not. There's a catchy kind of thing I heard one time about humility. It's like humility is not thinking of yourself too highly. It's not thinking of yourself too lowly. It's not thinking of yourself. And that maybe gets the idea, okay? That what Paul is describing is not a false self-abasing here of, oh, no, I'm no good at that, or, oh, I can't do anything. It's just a removal of self altogether. Thoughts or comments or questions on that? Or have I muddied the waters completely here? Okay, maybe along a similar line, but a different phrase. have become or must become or must be. Notice how this phrase comes up and is used. In chapter 3, verse 18, let no man deceive himself. If any man among you thinks that he is wise in this age, and we've talked about that, he must become foolish that he may become wise. So you have to undergo a change. Instead of being wise, you have to become something else. You have to become foolish. And then by becoming foolish, you can become wise. We have, and maybe we'll talk about why that is. Okay, similar idea in chapter 4, verse 13, but now speaking of himself. Here goes the scum. Okay, let me back up a little bit. This verse or this section of verses in chapter 4 has been on at least one other cross section. It's come up multiple times. Okay, and this is where this activity can go astray or can be limited, because context is always important, and just pulling something out of the context and slapping it on a paper along with other verses can in the end hurt us from really understanding what it is. This passage in chapter 4, I think we'll see when we get there, Paul is being somewhat too severely sarcastic in dealing with the Corinthians, okay? And he is, I think, going over the top in his language in order to really drive home to them how ridiculous their position is, or how their posture is probably a better word, okay? And I think Albert was getting at this in some of the things that he said, okay? But think about chapter 4, verse 10 to 13 in that kind of sarcastic tone in which Paul is saying, oh, y'all are so great. I didn't realize how wise and how important you guys are. And, oh, look at us over here, apostles. We are just, we're nothing, okay? And so in that tone, imagine Paul saying these things, chapter 4, verse 10, we are fools for Christ's sake, but you are prudent in Christ. We are weak, but you are strong. You are distinguished. We are without honor. To this present hour, we are both hungry and thirsty, and are poorly clothed, are roughly treated, are homeless. We toil, working with our own hands. When we are reviled, we bless. When we are persecuted, we endure. When we are slandered, we try to conciliate. We have become as the scum of the world, the dregs of all things, even until now. You see Paul's tone in there? Maybe that gets to what Christy and Justin were talking about. Sometimes when you're harsh, you got to be a little bit sarcastic to try to drive home the point that you're making here. And Paul seems to be doing that. Except, it's not fully that way. This is not totally tongue-in-cheek. And maybe you noticed that it kind of started that way maybe a little bit at the beginning when he said, oh, we're fools and you're wise. Okay. But then as he goes, he starts talking about we're hungry, we're thirsty, we're poorly clothed, we're roughly treated. And then that starts to sound like some of the other times when Paul would go through and describe the sufferings that he had as an apostle for preaching the message. And it's kind of like, oh, wait a second, I think he's serious. And that's why I include it in these other. I mean, he said earlier, you have to become foolish. Here he says, we have become like scum of the world. This is a real thing, okay? This is what Paul and the apostles, as maybe the examples of this, but go back even to Jesus. What did Jesus do? Jesus, although he was in the form of God, humbled himself, taking on the form of a man, becoming in human form, okay? So there is a becoming of something else, a humbling of oneself to become even something as undesirable as scum. And for Paul, I think what we would see as was true of Jesus, it was not just a manner of speaking, okay? It was not as if Jesus acted as if he was a criminal executed and, humiliated publicly. No, Jesus was actually executed and humiliated publicly as a criminal. So there's a profound point here about becoming foolish in the eyes of the world, becoming rejected in the eyes of the world. In chapter 6, verse 7, practically what that means is that when there is a disagreement with a brother or sister, that we would actually take on the hurt. That we would take on the blame. Chapter 6, verse 7, in the context of lawsuits against each other, He says, you really, as soon as you take this to court, it's a defeat for you that you have lawsuits with one another. Why not rather be wronged? Why not rather be defrauded? That's the attitude. Something wrong has been done against me. I have a right, as we're so enamored with in our country. I have a right to this, but I have become something different. I have become scum of the earth. And so if I get trampled on, even if I'm trampled on by my own brother, that's what I signed up for. Okay? That's a better way to handle the disagreement in chapter 6 than going to court with your brother or sister. And then in 9:22, same idea, Paul, in the context also of giving up his own rights as a minister of the gospel, he says, to the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, so that I may by all means save some. I do all things for the sake of the gospel, that I may become a fellow partaker in it. Okay, which of course is the payoff. You become something else. You become lowly. You become foolish. You become weak, so that you can become a partaker of the gospel, as Paul says there in those verses. So, thoughts or questions or comments on any of that? Yeah, Justin.
When you were referencing chapter 4 of 1 Corinthians, it reminded me of chapter 4 of 2 Corinthians, where you see this theme of humility, where, you know, in 1 Corinthians you see this theme of Paul's humility and his reproof of the Corinthians, and then in 2 Corinthians you see his humility in his relationship with the gospel, and he describes how he and the apostles are these fragile jars of clay that get broken and beaten, but what's really important is the message within, or the contents that are within those jars, and that's the true treasure. So all of this effort that they put forth is to one consistent end goal, and that's to spreading the gospel and to unify the brethren.
Yeah, Brian?
Yes, and everything that we've talked about, it occurs to me that it seems to be captured substantially by the parable of the men and the talents. You have the talents being a metaphor, if you will, for everything that God has given us in this world, the knowledge, and the things that the Corinthians took pride in, their knowledge, their might, and their wealth. And of course, when we go through the parable, the one talent man who received the least provided no yield to God and was condemned. And what I see here is, at least in the collective, and maybe the majority, I don't know, the Corinthians are 5-talent people. Yet, they're yielding nothing also, because they're using the things that God gave them, which could have planted the seed and nurtured the seed through watering to give God the growth. They instead use that as claiming credit for it and squandering their talents and boasting of it and being arrogant. And they wasted that which God gave them.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Justin. And then the last phrase I'll point out to you is this idea of not seeking your own. And maybe this was a connection, maybe a verbal connection that was able to tip you off as you were looking at these. But in chapter 10, verse 32, again, in the context of this discussion of meat sacrificed to idols, give no offense, Paul says, either to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God, just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, that they may be saved. And then in the chapter on love, in chapter 13, love does not seek its own, alongside all those other things. And that just fits well with what we have already said, that it's not about you, okay? It's not about me. We don't seek for our own. So in the context of chapter 10, I may love eating meat, but if it's causing someone else to stumble, well, then I don't seek what I want to do. I don't seek my own rights or my own liberties. I seek the profit of other people, the profit of the many, and that goes over even my own desire. And you know, that's love. that was commented on earlier as clearly running through all of this. And real love, which is necessary, is not seeking my own good, but seeking the good of the other person. Okay. I'm going to go back to, I think we had to rush through this on Wednesday. But it fits well because on Wednesday we were talking about wisdom. We talked about arrogance last Sunday. And so all of that in mind, and then thinking about the idea of humility, how Paul is trying to counteract what's going on in Corinth, the prideful attitudes. 3 times in Corinth, and this is to Brian's comment about the talents, right? They think they are so great. And maybe they are. Maybe they have received, as Brian points out, it seems like they have received quite a bit, okay? But Paul says, how you think about yourself matters. So if you think you are wise in this age, then become foolish. We looked at that already. Verse 2 of chapter 8, if anyone supposes that he knows anything, he is not yet known as he ought to know. If anyone thinks he is a prophet or spiritual, in chapter 14, in the context of the spiritual gifts that they've received, let him recognize that the things which are right to you are the Lord's commandment. But if you don't recognize it, you will not be recognized. So again, from the first of these, if anyone thinks passages, you really want to be wise, you have to become foolish. True wisdom, and remember this in our Proverbs class, right? True wisdom begins with, it's unfair to ask quiz questions in a class that we haven't had in a quarter, right? But the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. The fear of the Lord, yeah. So that was Proverbs, right? You start with God is the creator. I don't know anything. I'm just here to listen and learn. Okay, that's what Proverbs says is where wisdom is to be found. The beginning of wisdom is this: get wisdom, and that's maybe similar to what Paul is saying. Okay, in the second part, okay, knowledge on its own puffs up, makes arrogant. But true knowledge is, you could say, it's relational. True knowledge is found in God. It's given from God. And so true knowledge is with love, in love. Love for God, love for others. And then the last one, true spirituality. They thought they were so spiritual because of all the gifts that they had. But true spirituality is in submission to God and his commandments, which if you allow me again to go 30 seconds on this, I think that's important for today because we have a sense in our world that to be spiritual is to be free of rules and regulations. And you kind of go where God tells you and you listen to a voice in your head and you do things that are maybe radical or progressive or, against the norm, okay? But to follow rules in a book or abide by principles and follow rules in a book that's, thousands of years old and has been the same all this time and doesn't fit with our society and our culture, that doesn't seem very spiritual, okay? But Paul says, you want to be spiritual, you recognize God and his commandments and you submit to that. Anything else is not recognized by the Lord, okay? All right, so that I think encapsulates some of the things that we've been talking about. Real quickly, I think we do have about 5 or 6 minutes. I didn't want to throw this on here, and then it'll flow nicely into our discussion on Wednesday. Okay, so you become scum of the world. Okay, you become nothing, as Paul says. Why? Why in the world would you surrender yourself like that? Why would you empty yourself like that? 3 things I'll suggest to you from the verses that are in front of us. The first is because when all of us are honest, we realize God is the source of all. He has given us everything. Remember, Paul and Apollos can plant and water. God is the one that did all the work in growing the church, growing the Christians in Corinth. Okay, you become foolish to become wise because the wisdom is not in me. God is the source of all wisdom. Okay, it's not on here unless I missed it. But remember, in Corinthians, Paul will say, "What do you have that you did not receive?" I was thinking about that recently, and that should maybe be our homework. Go home and think about, meditate, reflect for a minute, and think, what am I most proud of? What is it about me that I'm really satisfied about, or I'm really proud of? That I'm this way. I have this character trait, or I do this thing that I feel really good about it, and it probably is a really good, godly thing. Okay, and then think, in light of Paul saying, what do you have that you did not receive? Why do you have that trait? Why do you have that practice? Why do you do that? And before you even get to, oh, well, God has given us the mercy to develop in the way that he wants, before you even get to that, just think, well, it's probably somebody taught me that. It's probably somebody that emphasized that in my life, and they hammered it, and I developed it, and I'm thankful I developed it. But I'm standing on the shoulders of giants here with anything that's good about my life. Okay, what do you have that you did not receive? And that, I think, gets to the heart of why Paul is saying, you got to become nothing. It begins with a recognition, and going back to chapter 14, that everything comes from the Lord, and then through the Lord's ministers, servants, people in our life, those things are passed down to us, and we cannot claim, to be the source of any of those things. Okay, so humility. Why? Because God is the source of all. But then, why is I'm shifting the meaning of why here. Okay, so that's humility. Why humility? For what purpose? For what reason? Okay, because our lives are His glory. So we become nothing. This is chapter 2, verse 2. I know nothing except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. Okay. Chapter 4, verse 10. We're fools, but it's for Christ's sake. Okay. I become all things to all men. In chapter 9, why? For the sake of the gospel. Okay. So as I empty myself, as I become scum of the world, everything then gets turned towards Christ. It's His message, it's His glory, it's His work. Everything gets consumed by Him. He's the source, and so I'm just giving it all back to Him. Okay, it belongs to Him anyway, and so I'm giving it back. Okay, but then within that, our lives are also, as we see over and over again, it's been commented at least once about love running through these passages. Our lives are for the profit of others. It's not about me. It becomes about other people, even those who have wronged us in chapter 6. The lost in chapter 9. I'm trying to win as many as possible, and so I'm giving myself up for that work. The many others, you see that over and over again in these passages. You humble yourself for the sake of others. And so, this, I think we're starting to see come into shape here, how Paul is addressing the problems in Corinth. We understand the arrogance. We understand how they're puffed up, whether by wisdom and their knowledge, or they're puffed up by their status, or they're puffed up by their wealth. That puffing up, that arrogance is swelling towards destructive behavior in the church that is dividing between factions or between groups or cliques or rich and poor or people offending each other. This is the problem. So what does Paul do? He preaches humility all the way throughout the book. That is the answer for the arrogance. If they can solve their arrogance with humility, then the underlying problem will be closer to being solved, which will help to solve what's going on the surface. And so, because I started with the two main examples of this in 1 Corinthians, I'll just come back to those to show you. Okay, so there's factions in the church in chapters 1 to 4. So what would you expect if we knew there was factions in the church? We knew chapter 1 to 4 is where Paul deals with factions. How would we expect him, to address it? Maybe he's going to have, advice for a teaching schedule. Make sure, I got to stay near the microphone. He's going to have advice for a teaching schedule to make sure you put together a schedule to where more people are teaching and the popular guys aren't teaching as much. Or maybe there's going to be, behavior adjustments for the teachers. Paul spends much of the first 4 chapters talking about how the gospel is foolishness, driving home what should be in each of our hearts, that the gospel is not about being puffed up. The gospel is about being nothing, being scum of the earth. And throughout, Paul will keep referring to his own example, as we've seen, of being a humble servant. And that's all he is. That's all anybody is. And that is how Paul begins to address the problems of factions in the church. What about the meat eaters of chapter 8 through 10? There's a offense given. This would be the perfect time for Paul just to say, all right, I'm going to clear it up. Do this, don't do this. If you don't like it, get over it. Okay? It's not how Paul addresses the problem in chapters 8 to 10. One, he spends a whole bunch of time talking about something that seems totally unrelated. Chapter 9 seems like it's just he's, gone off on a tangent, talking about his own forfeited rights. But he will also, as we've seen recently, give a history lesson of Israel's failures, where the lesson is, let the one who stands take heed lest he fall. So humility is one of the key answers for Paul in the book of 1 Corinthians. We'll talk about another one of those answers on Wednesday. So look over chapter 6, cross section number 6, and we'll look at that in a few days. Thank you so much.